there's enough humor, there's enough loyalty to the Yiddish storyteller, but yet there's something else. And this is what hopefully we're going to undress the onion. We're going to go for the pshat of the story. We're going to go to a little bit of the economic and social information. And then, of course, we're going to ask the question, is this book worthwhile recommending, championing it? What does it have and what doesn't it have? Because you are the indoctrinated. You already know. In a large part of our coronavirus-powered retreat to the flatlands, deprived of the richness of experience beyond imagination, the Lo Shtetl gives us a very pleasant surprise. It begins like a Chem story. I expected gross, self-confessed, work-less job like that. The author of the Mensch Handbook. He's also writing a magazine, a monthly magazine on real estate. So he's inspired by the feeling that the Jewish story is fascinating. But what about the fascination of a town that kind of disguised itself and escaped all the anti-Semitism, all the pogroms for a century? So hello to 1920 and 2020. And right here and right now, we're opening up Max Gross's The Lo Shtetl, and we meet a disaster, a terrible disaster. Pesha and Ishmael don't get along. They just got married, and the two of them are absolute enemies, like Isaac Bashevis Singer, Enemy, a Love Story. Well, this is Perfect Enemies, a love story. And the two of them get into the conversation that Max Gross is comfortable with. Well, many publishers would say, hello, Shaban, hello, Steingart, hello, Philip Roth. Well, I don't quite put it on that madriga, but I can tell you that the feeling is really there. Well, we want a divorce, they say. A divorce in this town, tears in her eyes. They were not outpouring of grief. They were not even unhappy about, just relieved. They looked at each other. He didn't quite know what to say, I suppose. Those who witnessed the scene say the flash of temper was the same as Rabbi Sokolov, as seen in a few months earlier. If you didn't know any better, an unprejudiced observer would have had no trouble believing that he was a violent man. Moreover, the language he used was the kind that the world would make out of Cossack blush. I myself debated whether or not to commit the actual words Ishmael Lindauer used to paper, but I finally decided that it was more important to be truthful than to hew to the most delicate sensibility. So those readers who are sensitive to such matters might wish to skip a few pages ahead. Who is the narrator? Who is talking like that? Who is telling the story? In a Yiddish story, you have to have a storyteller. You have to decide, who do you think is talking? Who is telling me that I should now blush or close my ears or maybe just go on? You really are a cunt, aren't you? Pesha's mouth flung open. I beg your pardon? All this time, Ishmael said, all this time that you were being nice to me, it was only a trick, wasn't it? You're a disgusting man, and you're a whore. Pesha turned and began walking away. Oh, Ishmael thundered at the top of his voice. Needless to say, this was not the kind of scene that we witnessed every day in Kresko. A crowd surrounded Ishmael to make sure his crazed words wouldn't digress into any action. I married a disgusting, filthy little whore. And so it goes to page 18. The unpleasant affair, and thoroughly the rest of the day, the rabbis had to decide what would happen next between this loopy pair, because no one could believe that story was over. I have a theory, said Esther Rosen, and then another one pitches in, and another one pitches in, and neither of them will emerge from this nastiness and marry anybody else. They're in a no-exit situation, the Shtetl, because both Ishmael and Pesha have been tainted. They have been marked. And a face of an angel and a figure of a nymph. She is so beautiful. Pesha Rosenthal vanished the next morning, leaving a nary trace of herself behind. Her sister Hadassah went out all over town to look for her. Missing, she says, missing. What do you suppose happened to her? Well, she probably ran off, leaving Kresko. But the consensus was that leaving Kresko was a decision not dissimilar to suicide. Just be careful, said Rabbi Glock, for those who falsely accuse the righteous lose paradise for themselves. What if we have a murder in Kresko? A murder had not been committed in Kresko in more than 111 years. Yeah. Back then, according to our town archives, an expedition was sent out to the Polish authorities while the murderers, a man who killed his brother over a business dispute. And this is the way you are reading into the story. But this is not where most Max Gross is leading you. He is just enticing you to feel comfortable, to feel that you are reading a kind of a Helm story. Ishmael Lindauer managed to sleep away before morning. He managed to get out of Kresko and look for Pesha. Dear Gershon, I decided to leave Kresko. I don't believe I will ever again be at ease here. My punishment, I'm sure, she'll receive the world to come, but the fact remains that I never touched a single hair on her head. All right, so what's the dilemma now? What are we going to do? When 2 weeks had passed, neither Pesha nor Ishmael, they decided to send a shaliach. They decided to send another shlemiel to look for Ishmael and Pesha. And who do they send? Yankel. Well, something very interesting about Yankel. Yankel is also a mamzer. Yankel's mother is also a prostitute. Yankel is a kind of not a gain and not a loss in our little Kresko. He works in the bakery. And of course, when they decide that the two rabbis, Sokolov and Katzenelson, that we need a shaliach, we all hope that you will come and you'll come back. And however, the ground shall say, the chariot found the spot approved in the town square. They painted, the door opened, and they let Yankel go. The three men who had stepped out of the chariot all conversed with one another at the row of the chariot. Yankel, Rabbi Sokolov finally ventured. Hello, Rabbi. And what is this? Is this the Messiah? They want you to know what's going on, Yankel said. What should I tell them? So by the time you come to page 26, you understand that our poor Yankel met the authorities in the next town, and the authorities, of course, did not know what to make of him. What is Yankel? What do you mean you don't know about Kresko? What do you mean you don't know about town? Our beloved Kresko was the only one to survive the onslaught? Yankel said, this time with a note of triumph. The army somehow overlooked, and we were spared. The town was quiet again before someone had loud enough for everyone to say, oh. So Yankel looked as if he had been expecting a greater, more exultant response. And one could be very disappointed on his face. A lot has happened in the last 100 years, Yankel said. These men will explain everything. Well, they brought Yankel back in a helicopter. And guess what the helicopter messaged to the people? The Mashiach came many years ago, Yankel said, plucking a handkerchief in his trousers. His name was David Ben-Gurion. This is not the Mashiach. They look at the chariot, and of course, the re-entry of the authorities into Kresko is quite important. By the time you end the first chapter and the second chapter, and you get to know what Yankel is like and what the town is like, you also get to understand that this shtetl is not any different from all other shtetls, which means three things are most important: the economics, the social, and the religious. And the religious don't get along, and the social don't get along, and the economics don't get along. The merchants want theirs, the tradesmen want theirs. There are 8 different minyanim. When you come to Krakow today and you look up at the shul, the Ramah shul, you see 8 minyanim. You see the carpenter's minyan, the butcher's minyan, the Sephardic minyan, all different minyanim. Well, it's up to us to decide what has changed and what hasn't changed. But it was certainly what has changed is modernity. And modernity has cars, and modernity has technological advances, and the world has phones. And of course, when Yankel asks him, oh, who made all that? And the answer is the Goyim have invented everything. Well, you have to laugh because you are the indoctrinated. But of course, the millennials today don't really understand that there's a number of right comments made by all the characters that play the 2020 situation. And it begins to be absurd, but at the same time, it's very painful. You are to go on an adventure, Yankel. And Yankel said to Smokey, why, who's going to send me there? We are sending you. Find Ishmael, find Pesha, and bring them back. Why, Rebbe Katzenelson asked, no one is asking you to go out and catch a murderer. You're only going to report one. And who knows, it might be nothing at all. But I've never been outside the Shtetl in my life. Well, who has? But I wouldn't know the first thing about contacting the authorities. Nobody does, Katzenelson answered. It's not as though we're going to send you out without maps and compasses or food and water. You'll be provided for. And who's going to look after my booba? Don't fret about it, lad, Katzenelson said. If that's the worst of your worries, you'll be fine. Your cousin Gittel will take care of her. I can't do that, Yankel said. I would never dream of leaving her. Rabbi Katzenelson doesn't have patience for this. Maybe this was a mistake, he said loudly. But of course, Sokolov persevered. Here, I thought I was giving you something as a gift. What a lucky man. I wish I was young and off to the big city. And here I'm wishing I could trade places with you. I guess I was wrong. So there was always a feeling in the writings of the Zionists and the writings of B'Shev Singer and the writings of Vera, all of them, that somehow there was always an ambiguity about staying in the Shtetl and leaving the Shtetl. Seeing the big world that they heard about and all its progress and all its anti-Semitism and all its goyim, but at the same time, modernity was always very attractive. So by the time he leaves, guess what, the next 100 pages? He is a subject of doctors in a hospital, a neurological laboratory, a language he does not speak because Polish is very weak, and the people who speak to him and talk to him do not understand him. They give him directions. An old mother with a black kerchief wrapped around her head was standing guard. Yankel turned back and said, she pointed to him and said, go in. And he went in. As scared as he was, they started examining him. Is he of this world or is he not? Is he bipolar? Is he neurologically affected? Is he a special child? All the doctors now planned for him, gave him food, of course, which he didn't eat. And here it's like a Malam with a fixture. He is so adamant, shakes his head, he's rather starved. They get him kosher food. And he looked for clean-cut and well-groomed men in middle years to talk to, but none of them came around. Not in the park, not in the streets. He accepted all the misfortunes in life that planned for him. Is Yankel in to hell? When the church bells rang at 3 o'clock, he hadn't managed to get a single person to look at his note of paper, and the note of paper says, call the police. Is there a bakery? Well, he found a bakery. I guess by the time you get to page 100 and the doctors are finished with him and they're sick and tired of him and they realize that they can't get any answers, he is just one of those strange beings that speaks another language. And one doctor does come through because there are nice men in the world, despite all the terrible people walking around. And he's the one who kind of takes him under. How do you like that part of the first 150 pages? I will summarize it for you because Max does a good job to tell us about the Soviets in 1920. It tells me enough about economics and politics for me to understand that Dr. Milowski and Johann Fishbein academic title made the rest of the staff feel less troubling, assigning a man who had no experience in such matters to a grim job none of them preferred to do themselves. And Fishbein, while hesitant, had the prospect of importance of telling a man a tragedy in words that he couldn't and didn't have to puzzle over. Yankel, do you remember how you told me that when you first got to Smoky, you asked for a Jewish quarter? And when the woman said to you, where? What? Fishbein said later one Friday, yes, so why do you suppose that was? I suppose she didn't want to talk to me. No, that's not possible. But didn't you know that there was no Jewish ghetto in Smoky? I heard there was. Well, certainly there was, but there is no more. You know what happened to the ghetto? No. It was totally destroyed more than 3/4 of a century ago. And then he gives him the whole Jewish history. So if there is a millennia sitting at your table and you just gave him one page of Max Gross's Shtetl, you understand it was not just Smoky, he says. All over Poland, Jews were rounded up, destroyed. The German army went from town to town, hunted down Jews wherever they could. Yankel shook his head. Terrible, very sad. Almost all the Jews of Poland were killed. Yankel's eyes, which were cast on the floor, suddenly shut up with surprise. All the Jews of Poland? How could that be? The Nazis, Fishbein stopped. He was unsure. Nazi opposed to German? Germans were very efficient. They kidnapped the Jews. They took them out of camps. They gassed them to death. And of course, Sonia Fishbein had good reasons to be concerned. Hassan's Semitism had been written on the curve of his nose and the olive tinge of his skin and the richness of his dark eyes. No one needed to hear the Jewish sound of his last name to guess his ancestry. They're trying to explain to Yankel what a Jew is like. Yankel nodded and said finally, you know, you could have fooled me. My father was Jewish, but my family became Catholic a long time ago, says Fishbein. Oh, Yankel said. So did all the Jews convert, like during the Inquisition? Now Fishbein was shocked. What about the Jews in Krakow? They were killed. Warsaw, they were killed. Bialystok, they were killed too. And you know, what is Yankel's reaction to all this dissertation of 3 pages of the Holocaust? How dumb do you guys think I am? Yankel, the Jew, cannot himself accept the fact that this is the summary of the Jewish tragedy of the 20th century. So after almost 3 months, the perception took shape among the administration. Our Lady of Mercy Hospital discharged Yankel, and Yankel started looking for Pesha and Ishmael. And he went through some very interesting escapades. He is a Jew who says he's from a town in the middle of the forest. It sounds stupid now, but he says that a band of gypsies came through his town a couple of months ago, and he hitched a ride with them. And the only name he remembered was Zuka. I was trying to find out if there was any truth in the boy's story. The ominous mien that Ferka had perfectly suddenly seemed to vanish. This burglar now just looked confused. You mean the kid is from Kreskol? The gypsy asked. Yeah, a slender kid, not quite too tall. Couldn't have grown too much. Just a little beard. Yeah, we gave him a ride to Smoky a couple of months back, so what? Well, The narrator goes, "It's peculiar, I suppose, that after so many decades, proving to the world exactly how disinterested we were in the comings of going of the Goyim, that we should all have collectively changed our minds at once. But that's more or less what happened. Yankel's role in our rediscovery came a relatively speedy conclusion after Dr. Milowski's brief capture. And sure enough, he now, almost on page 125 now, all the doctors finish their briefs, sprinkle their talks, and the names are real. Hey, the names are very real. And Yankel now summarizes the 20th century. So your millennia is sitting at the table. I have sometimes lost track of what Sikorsky told us that afternoon. And later we learned in a few months, the fundamentals of the last century were recounted. Listen, World War II, the Cold War, the creation of the State of Israel, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, a man on the moon, eradication of polio, instant coffee. When Sikorsky spoke about World War II, he was determined that he would not be left with the same doubt as Yankel. He produced 11 photographs. Underneath it says millions died. He produced the glossy black and white images of Babi Yar. Poland was almost completely cleansed of Jews. As he said the word cleansed, the Gentile's face changed colors, as if he had accidentally said something impolite. We all nodded respectively, but think, just think. Rabbi Katzenelson, who lingered over the photos longer and longer, the two rabbis are now learning what the last 50 years were under the Bolsheviks. They realized by 1940 until 1980, abided according to the whims of the dictates of their neighbors, they somehow escaped the cruelty of communism. The Gentile was somewhat more animated talking about Bolshevik calamity than the German was. He told us how the Bolsheviks had taken over the club, the chess clubs, the sports clubs, and now you're learning exactly where Max wants us to be. He wants us to know enough about the Jews' relationship to the outside, the Jews' relationship to the Goyim, the skepticism, the fear, and maybe, of course, the insulation and the escape of misery. What do you mean there's an Israel? What do you mean Jerusalem? What do you mean? I don't understand. And after Sikorsky realized nobody had bothered to tell Yankel that the Jews had returned to the ancestral homeland, he took on the duty himself. The exile is over, Yankel said. Yes. When did it happen? Very briefly, he explained to him the bare bones story of David Ben-Gurion and the Irgun, the 1948 War of Independence, and subsequent wars. Ben-Gurion was the Messiah, Yankel said. Well, Sikorsky said, unmoved for a few minutes, I suppose. Rabbi Sokolov's study, refusing to enliven the tale with anything that could be considered grandiose, merely told us about the Jewish Messiah and the Jewish Agency and Herzl, and about the Yishuv. And so by the time you get to almost the spine of the page, you get the idea that modernity is dangerous. And yet nostalgia and going backwards is impossible. We don't mean in the Shtetl life itself. We mean in the acceptance of the Jew in the world. And the acceptance of the Jew in the world is not easy to portray because most of it in America has been a kind of a tool to both Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner and, of course, Hollywood and movies. And if you really ask about the Jew, you will probably get a good joke, a Cherem joke. But if you are Ruth Viss and you teach at Harvard Yiddish and you want to explain what the Jew is like, you have to realize it's no joke. It's only a vehicle of survival. And as much as the Jew is portrayed in every possible manner, where the antidote to this young millennial at your table, if it's not Bashevi Singer and if it's not Mel Brooks, will be Agnon. And the country's our most acclaimed writer should have been able to calm down all our concerns about anti-Semitism. Agnon's words, Agnon's depiction of family, Agnon's depiction of the worthwhile of study, and the rest of it. But how effective is it? Today, it's not. Young people don't know who Agnon is. Young people don't know who all the other authors I mentioned are. Chaim Grade is not at the front of the shelf, the yeshiva and the rest of it. Chaim Grade should have received the Nobel Prize, but he died so young. So here, our story continues, and Gross is bringing in what he has to do now. And what is the crux of the book, and what is the gift of the book? Not so much the Shtetl and its hardness to modernity, not the argument about how we're going to change zlotys to rubles and build a post office, because, you know, the Goyim are not going to allow the town to exist without paying taxes, without having a butcher, and without the schools and without the hospitals. The taxes have to be collected by the Jews themselves. But the Siem has to have, of course, a representative. And here, the delegates were frowning, not seeming particularly satisfied with the response, and questioning where in this town, in a few hours, and Rabbi Silbowitz and the Rabbinic Council will have to rule. And we have been victims of Lashon Hara for 2,000 years. And nobody should have reason not to do business with us or stay right here in every inn. We were given an official pronouncement signed by 5 rabbis, written on sheepskin. We are an organized community. Well, we understand the Vad Arba Haratzot, and we understand how the Jewish community survived, and all of the area that we call today Belarus and the Ukraine and Poland were all together connected in Hebrew and, of course, in Yiddish. Kreskol, Kreskol, my hearts belong to you. Kreskol, Kreskol, no town under the sun is finer. Let them sing it atop the mountaintop with voices ablaze with fires. And sure enough, inside the Shtetl, the love and the nostalgia continued. But outside the world, into the Shtetl, was a very huge, impossible adjustment, psychologically, technologically, in every other way. You understand where the rabbis don't get along. You understand why Sokolov and Katzenelson will argue if modernity is good for us or not. But Max doesn't have to worry about that. Max Gross has to go to the Gehenna Administrative. And this Gehenna, of course, has to change the language. And into the change of all this culture, language, politics, economics, comes Leonid Spector. He arrived more than 20 years after Jack Krinsky's brief ingress in Kreskol. And unlike the typical Kreskolite, he was educated, he was worldly, he built a small cottage on the edge of the woods, and he took up in the yeshiva where he taught Aramaic. Physically, he was short and lithe, and his most distinctive feature was a patch he wore over his left eye. To anyone who asked Spector, he would give a private lesson in Polish or in Russian and in French. He would tell those who questioned the purpose of this that everyone should know a second language and everyone should know everything. You have two things here. Everyone should know everything is the title of Isaac Babel's book. That even the Jew in the Shtetl was told you have to know everything. Physics and math and Polish and a little Yiddish and another language. But the interesting thing about Spector is also that he reminds us of another character that came back from the Holocaust back home and wrote The Awakening, Levi. And the whole idea of coming back to Milan, coming back to Turin, and not being able to talk about the Holocaust. Spector is not able to describe what he saw. He knows that they will not believe him. He knows that he will be put under scrutiny for being sane, but the Germans are consistently bad, he said, forever and ever. The Germans are our enemy. They always will be forever and ever. His students asked him, and not the Poles? And not the Russians? And not the Ukrainians? They hated Jews too. Everybody else is a mix, Leonard pronounced. I've known good, courageous Poles. I've known others who were perfect swine. But the Germans are consistently bad. They hate Jews with every fiber of their being. They're all irredeemable, he said with such conviction that it seemed fruitless to further counterpoint. Spector was intimate with the wonders of the modern world that others had merely heard about. When you read about Spector, what do you think Gross is trying to bring us? Besides, of course, Viktor Frankl, and besides the whole idea of the survivors that came back, Primo Levi is a perfect example, who would not describe more, spent most of his spare time by himself. And if Max Gross has a contribution in this book, by the time you get to the middle, to page 200, and he changes voice after that, and there are no enemies of the Jews here, no Germans here, not even any Poles, not for years and years and years. This is why you stayed here? Yes, said Rabbi Sokolov. Yes, there are no enemies here. It's a very nice town, of course, Spector said, but it's not home. Again, the same thing as Leon Levy, the same thing as Viktor Frankl. The rabbi nodded. Well, then just stay for tonight. Naturally, there's plenty of space in the prayer house. And Spector stayed. They're just stories, he told them. They're just stories. I won't tell you more than that. By the time you finish with Spector, you realize Max has done a decent job introducing the spirit of the book, which is probably his greatest gift and the most difficult one. I'm going to open it for you now because the love story and Pesha running from Krakow and Warsaw with her pimp and her maiden that protected her in the life of prostitution. And Ishmael, of course, is chasing after her. And this is the mother and father in him who know how to write a good mystery. Who is going to come and find Pesha first? And she's Katie, and she changes her name to Catholic. And when I see a young girl off on her own, mistreated, something in me cries out, Yankel says, I want to help. I want to save her. It sounds silly, but this is what it is. And Yankel changes his whole position in life and purpose in life. And they thought Ishmael murdered me, says Pesha. Yes, he says when he finds her. I pay 200 zlotys to sit on this bed and talk to you. Your family is grieving for you, Pesha. Come home. No, Pesha says, I can't. I should have left a long time ago. I should have left a note. I have no regrets. I'll go to Paris. I'll go to Jaffa. I'll go to New York. I'll open up a cafe. And perhaps she already learned that indiscretion was dangerous in her line of words, that it was wiser to keep any fantasies to herself. However, this moment of incaution was also a gesture of trust. She met her landsman. She wanted to talk to him about the Shtetl. An involuntary vote of confidence with him. Yankel couldn't help but be moved. And Yankel went out, and he kept looking for her, and she kept escaping him. And it's a wonderful love chapter until you get to disquiet. And when you get to the disquiet and you realize that all of Yankel's dreams and all of Yankel's mannerism is going to help Pesha, you come to the conclusion. There's other forms of sorcery that took place that evening that would become apparent in the coming days. Either you think the Gentile law is dangerous, said Katzenelson, but here in our town, we don't need a Yankel, and we don't need a Pesha, and we don't need an Ishmael. Well, he comes back and forth, the author, He wants to tell us that everything that the rabbis were discussing, pro and con, about making the town modern or about staying as much as they can in the old world and changing zlotys and changing money and counting hundreds of tens of zlotys to buy a piece of bread. This whole economic chapter is very, very informative. But that's not what I want you to deal with for the next few minutes. For the next Jewish 18 minutes, I want you to tell me the scene that affected you, the subject matter that affects you, and how do you think the gift, there is a gift here that will enhance everything that Shaban and Philip Roth and Malamud and Bello were coming to the end of the century. They're all gone. Now there's a new generation. They want to deal with one specific thing. And what do you think that is? Anti-Semitism. How do you create the art, the language, not the justification, not anymore any kind of apologetics. This is not Socrates' speech before suicide. This is not tell him the goyim, we've had it. This is exactly the 2020 standing right there, looking at the CM and looking at the Polacks in a moment of rage, answering them back, turning like a monster and telling Yankel, I am not coming back. And yet Yankel is trying to tell her that there are people who love her. And your whole life you spoke Yiddish. How can you start talking Polish? How can you change your skin? How can you start talking a language? Nobody speaks Yiddish anymore in Krakow, Yankel. Yiddish is unheard in Warsaw. But the klezmers are playing. And it sounds Jewish. And for that reality, you go to the reference books that are written today, not the historical fiction, but here, the Shtetl by Eva Hoffman, the encounter of the Jews today in Poland to the Jew. So now I ask you in the marketplace, what goes on in the market of Warsaw without the Jews? Well, he thinks for a moment, well, now things are much worse. For a moment, he looks very surprised. Yes, he laughs. Ours are just the same. Everyone always walks all over the peasants. But the peasants manage somehow, I suggest. Oh, yes, he says. And he goes on to tell me with relish about the pieces of land and all the houses and all the cattle that he got after the Jews left. And after the war, we worried that without the Jews, nobody would know how to trade. Well, we slowly are learning to do it too. This is 70 years after the war. We are learning how to be merchants. We're learning how to be a country. Zipek stood by the conversation looking a bit uneasy. Although for a long time, it seemed the association with Jews mystified him. Buying and selling for profit was supposed to take devilish cleverness. It was supposed to be inherently dishonest, and that has not changed. The Jew today in Europe, right there in 2021, is still seen as a shrewd, oh yes, you guys know all the tricks. They'll take your money as well as anybody, the ruddy man said, and he stumbled on a terrific bit of insight. Is that all it takes then to talk him out of his prejudices? A simple argument. Can I do that? No. Undoubtedly, he will return to them and to his fathers and his great fathers on the same thing at the supper table. They go all the way far back. Although by now it's impossible to disentangle all the roots of anti-Semitism or remember where they came from, impossible to account for one man's friendliness, another man's indifference, and yet another man's hatred. There are those who dislike the Jews, there are those who are afraid of Jews, and there are those that don't care, and there are those that are friendly. When you finish a reference book like the Shtetl that starts with the Renaissance and you realize we've been in Poland for 700 years, active in Poland. And when you go to the yearbooks, this is my family. In the yearbook of Bialystok, and you go to my family in the other yearbook, and you read, and you realize that the Shtetl protected, but the Shtetl, of course, did not deal with modernity. But where again does anti-Semitism lie? Where again can an artist like Max Gross, 42 years old, who walks around Borough Park, who walks around, Brooklyn as an American kid, went to Israel, puts together a readable, and of course, a learning and inspiration and information. Financially, the Gentiles have been among the groups most affected by the diminished reputation of Kreskol. They did not accept the Shtetl. While some of the Gentiles transplants quietly thought that the question of Kreskol's authenticity was worth examining, they gave up on it. The only reason people like Meserik and Vuchniak settled in Kreskol the first place was that these Jews suddenly had money to spend. The Americans were coming and making the area filled with bearded Jews who spent money, spoke a little Polish, mostly Yiddish. Internet reception was appalling. One had to drive 40 minutes through the backwoods to get a decent restaurant. But today, the restaurants have business, and nothing will stop them from an economy that's growing. They welcome the Jews as an economic necessity. And many Polacks, of course, walk into the Jewish towns, not just after the war, but right now and right here. The same thing goes for Germany. The same thing goes for Kiev. The same thing goes in many other places. The investigation continues when Yankel picks up a taxi. I don't have your kind of money, he says to the driver. The guy says, well, best of luck to you. Well, Yankel's disappointment was unmistakable for a moment. And then he says, do you have any advice for me? Well, he wasn't going to entice Yankel to become a paying customer. So he says, look, we'll just go. And when we get to the town, we will then manage to pay. So, I don't want to spoil your ending, but I want to discuss it with you. Because he does go back, and he does find a path, and he does find a path in the forest, and he gets out of the cab, and he walks the path, and he realizes an uncontrollable urge not to go any further. It felt uncontrollable urge to repeat the ancient words that had been chanted through the generations when his kind was confronted with the evil of man or nature. They were all Yankel had. Yankel might not have known his father, but his father no doubt spoke the same words as he did, and his father's father, and his father's father's father, and so on. They were, he realized, his inheritance. This profound truth brought Yankel to his knees. He bowed his head, and his voice rang out, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. Fini, and took his backpack and walked out away from Kreskol. Max wants to make a point about maybe what Thomas Wolfe said, you can't go home, baby. Or maybe he's trying to say something else. That somehow the disappearance of the town is a very clever idea, and they escaped the century. And yet the reappearance of the town brings us face to face with the reality of one thing. Despite Israel, despite the United States, despite everything we accomplished, we are responsible to the history, to the understanding of the relationships between the world and Poland and Russia and Germany and the Jews and what happened during that century. So much modernity that the Jews brought to the world, and yet so much of the sad history that was obviously cannot be helped. So I'm asking you, should Yankel go back or shouldn't he go back? Would you end the same way? Does the love story help the novel? Does Spectre help the novel? Or can I say thank you to Max for the one single gift that he, in a way, treated anti-Semitism in a kind of a special way that everyone can deal with it. I know you couldn't deal with it when Philip IV and Portnoy's complained, talk about the Goyim. No, that's too hard to take 50 years ago. But today, not too many are writing about anti-Semitism. There's no Malamud in The Fixer. There's no Wavelstein for You Understand Bellows. And Agnon is also gone. He's only in Yiddish and in Hebrew, but not in English. Nobody studies him in high school. Nobody studies him anymore, even in college. They study Yiddish. Shalom Aleichem is being studied because the language is so rich in nuance. Well, open up your mics, please. Would you recommend the book number 1? Do you think it enriches, enlightens, entertains, enough for a friend to read? Go ahead, anyone. Vaz, did you like the book? Vaz is gone? Right. Moshe, did you get to look at the book? Rabbi Krenzler, did you get to look at it? Go ahead, unmute yourself. I don't hear you. No, I don't hear you, darling. Unmute yourself.
Just to press the little in the upper right-hand corner of his.
Hello.
Hi. No, I just heard it through your eyes. Listening to you, I just heard the book. It's interesting because basically many of us have lived through a lot of what he talks about. Actually, he talked about the fact that many of us lived in Europe and we live today, and we all the faces that he spoke about. And it's interesting the way he looks at it.
Because if you were Chaim Grade today, and if you lived long enough, and you would produce 1,100 pages of the yeshiva, could we get our grandchildren, 25-year-old, 20-year-old at Columbia, to sit down and read it? Will they get the nuances?
No, they couldn't. It's very difficult. You can't create again what it was, what we lived through. You can't.
Right. Exactly.
America has its own kind of anti-Semitism. Did you hear of this new book, The Netanyahus?
Yeah.
I'd like to find out what you think of that.
Schmaltz, I do not champion it.
American University.
I do not champion it. I do not champion the schmaltz. This is not funny to become commercially, adorned with a name. I read it very quickly. The same thing with the Vixen. I thought I will read something about Ethel Rosenberg and the trial, and yet it wasn't. It was about an author. If I can recommend a real author that gives us something very special, Rabbi Krenzler is doing it, and that's this one.
Yes, I'm reading it now. It's a marvelous book. It's a marvelous book. That book, I recommend it very highly to everyone. I'm not even finished with it, but it's absolutely a great book.
The choice, because she's a therapist. She's 93. She lived through the Holocaust, and she can relate to any age group.
And she writes. She's 90 years old when she started writing this book, so she relives her experiences. And
so if you take Max, if you take the Schmendrick, trying to put together a nuanced anti-Semitism that is not, in a way, pulling you back, but pulling you in by using all the strategies that Shalom Aleichem used and Singer used, enemy and love story, and a little Bubermeise, and how the rabbis argue. I mean, Max goes, when I speak to him and I email him all the time, the one thing I had to say to him, hello, you had to take a name like Katzenelson, like Beryl and Yitzchak Katzenelson against the Sokolov? And he said, why? I said, because you did not walk the streets of Yerushalayim and the streets of Tel Aviv, and you realize that you are using two names of the Zionist movement that was so seminal, so important in the whole movement of poetry. And he had no idea. It's a good Jewish name, Sokolov. It's a good Jewish name, Katzenelson. But you see, you have to be very gentle and very erudite, and you have to read a great deal to know where these names belong. But to a Max Gross, who is 42, just a father of a 3-year-old, started to write this in 2015 and had to finish it because his publisher, he kind of put it all children together, a little bit of love, a little bit of past, a little bit of economics, enough of the political, Poland, Diem, the government, and at the same time, Yankel, which is always the Yaakov, which is always the fixer, which is always the standby Jew that you cannot change. Remember Malamud's fixer? Adazar tried to change him, and in every way he says no, and they shaved his beard and they tortured him, and he said no, Shema Israel. And that's the Jew. That's the Jew. He's fixed in history with a purpose, with his behavior. He's there to do, to know, to do exactly what he has to. With every reaction around him, with every anti-encounter, he is there steadfast. And at the end, of course, Max Gross has to say Shema, again, the same as Yankel and Abba Yaakov, all the way to Yaakov, Am Israel. And so in that respect, the book is very current, very up to date for the unindoctrinated. So how do you and I approach it for them? How do we bridge the generations? How do we recommend a book like that? Sheila, what do you think? Would you recommend it to your grandchildren?
I don't think you have to bridge a generation. I think the same thing exists here, especially now in this day and age. I mean, if you look at I don't know how you read it so fast. It takes me a day to read a page in the Netanyahu's and to understand it. It's a crazy book, but fabulous. You see that this guy, Reuben Bloom, who is supposed to be Harold Bloom, rolled into something take on Cornell University, the chairman of the department, to find out about the Jew. That portion is
hilarious.
Yeah, very anti-Semitic, but in a very generous way. So you could do me a favor, the chairman says, because you would know if he's the type of person that belongs in this university, which is a takeoff on Cornell, which I think, and the person happens to be Ben-Zion Netanyahu,
right?
To teach the Jew.
Right.
Then you find out about his idea of history, of Jewish history.
Right. You see how everyone is trying to do the same thing in a different way. They're trying to come to anti-Semitism from another door. It doesn't seem to work as a Hannah Arendt will teach in the new school of social research, totalitarianism and anti-Semitism and Pharaoh or Inquisition that door by itself is not open anymore to the young mind. But if you take another I'm waiting for you to react. Barbara, what do you think?
I did not read the book, sorry, but it sounds interesting and I look forward to read it. It reminds me, some of the threads that you were talking about remind me of a book, and I can't think of the name, I read it not too long ago, which was about, it's a place in Europe, and there was an older woman who came to visit her daughter. The daughter took her to a hotel. You know which book I'm talking about? A retreat. And the daughter was intermarried. She didn't want to talk about her Judaism. And this hotel actually tried to change the Jewish population. It used to be like a Jewish retreat. and it became something different when the government changed, but it still attracted a lot of Jews there. And they tried to change the Jews into being, you know, eating a certain way and talking actually even changing their accent. You don't know what book I'm talking about? You don't remember that?
When you find it, please email me. Exactly. Yeah. That's the same strategy. That's the same idea.
And the daughter, it was like part of the young daughter was taking her mother to get rid of her Judaism, but also like the age, it was all the old people were there. It was just like, you know, she wanted to be with her intermarried husband, but then in the end, it wasn't like quite that easy. Nobody read that book? You can help me out with the name?
Sounds like it has the same theme. You can run, but you can't hide.
Yeah, exactly.
I try to.
Yeah, and the whole book took place like at night. Everything was like very dark, you know? Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to try to, you know, even if young people today see the anti-Semitism, I don't think they appreciate the history, you know? Little before my time, but I was still very like fresh when I was young, and you know, I don't think they feel the connection as strongly as we do.
So you understand that when we were ready to accept all the movies and all the well, basically to become spectators of everything that was produced, besides the books, besides the volume of the Third Reich and all that, and we saw the movies and all that. We related to the people, we related to the faces. All this technologically, digitally has changed to dystopia. It has changed to Disney. It has changed to Thor. It has changed to mythology. So today, we as teachers, as parents, as grandparents, as lovers, as wives, we can't just go back to a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old who can read Camus, and he can read The Plague, and he can read about the doctor coming to the town and realizing that there's a pandemic and nobody's believing him. He can read about Leonid Spector in this book, who says, if I tell you, I'm not going to tell you because you probably will not believe me, but it is still the truth. And I will stay here in a way in my presence, and my presence will be the fact of the matter that I know, I lived through it, and I will tell you that that is true. So the young mind today needs the kind of literature, needs the kind of both visual and especially in a kind of a literary art form, to be able to, with Steingart and to be able with Shaban, to be able to look at the Jew and his role, where he's been and where he's going in the modern world today, which is on the internet, which is one world, which is one face. So you don't have to travel anymore. You just have to turn on a button and say, who am I looking at? You know? So that's why Max Gross, in a way, did something that, you know, others will probably follow. The whole cultura of the TVP, they will learn a great deal of information, but at the same time, it doesn't quite ramp down your throat. It's not intimidating. It's not threatening, and it's not dystopian. It's not meant to give you nightmares. It just means to engage you. Just engage you. Read the story with me. Who do you think is narrating this book? Who do you think Max Gross is not narrating it? Who's narrating this book? Who's telling the story about the Shtetl and what it was and why she can't go back? And why, Uncle, you go back? I'm going, who's telling the whole book? Pesha is. Pesha is Max Gross. Pesha is his vehicle. And maybe the fact that she's a prostitute is something that we could talk about. How can a woman be protected at the same time and at the same time do something that is so unacceptable and abusive? And I mean, is she Jewish in a way, in many ways, for this century? You know, how would she survive? Being beautiful and being good, a good person, and on her own, at the mercy of someone else to protect her. Very interesting that he found Pesha You know, he's a mamzer and he's like a son of a prostitute, and she's finding her survival through prostitution. Yes, dear.
Well, if you describe that the way you're describing it, it sounds like he looks as Pesha as what?
Yeah.
What figure does she present in his own personal life?
Yeah.
It's his mother.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, his love.
Pretty strong.
His love for woman, his love for mother, his love for his own life to survive. He has to save her. But she's not going to be saved by a man. She's going to be saved on her own volition, on her own effort, on her own.
Okay, so that in itself is a very modern
Jewish
idea.
concept. Yeah.
A modern idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Modernity is sort of fitting in there.
It's hard to take, and it's impossible to ignore. You know, all the pitfalls of modernity. And yet nostalgia was protective. The Shtetl in many ways escaped the century of horror, escaped the rape of Europe, escaped the rape in a way, just remained as they were, argumentative and stubborn and merchants, and the gypsies came, the gypsies
so
went.
Truly, when you think about it, truly as far as characteristics and as far as behaviors, has there been any change?
Modernity has brought the potential. Modernity has brought the potential. The Torah world has brought the potential. The Jew has come out with his potential to do, to give, to, in a way, to suffer, to protect themselves, and not to be protected by anybody else, but just the same Shema Israel, to be on his own, to protect himself with his own faith, like a Yaakov, like Am Israel. There's a lot of symbolism here, and that the young people can understand, because Israel is a reality, and American Jewry is a reality. But at the same time, they have to understand that our existence, the kind of Shtetl existence, is not backward.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the fact that we were in the 12th century for 100 years. No, we weren't. We were very much always in that century, surviving with all the mechanisms that we always have.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully we'll keep. That's the point. Hopefully we'll keep. I really want to thank you, everybody. Raz, I want to know if you like the book. I know you must have read it. Sheila, thank you. It's all good.
One day you have to review that book for us.
The Netanyahu's?
I find that is
hilarious.
Anti-Semitism in America. You know?
I know, but Sheila, will you allow me to go from literature to, anything but?
You don't think Joshua Cohn is literary?
Joshua Cohn is good, funny, modern, and belongs on the same shelf now, really, with Steingart and the rest of them. I agree. I'm
just to illuminate it for me. Would you do it?
I will meet you in November on the catwalk, and we will.
At December.
I want you to think of talk about literary total pleasure. Total pleasure is Hamnet. If you just listen to it by Maggie O'Farrell. Hamnet died at 11. He's Shakespeare's son. And William Shakespeare, not even mentioned in the book. Maggie O'Farrell picked up Agnes Hathaway, and the wife, and the mother of course, Hamnet, Hamnet. The next time we meet, I want you to share it with me. Just close your eyes and get the audio, unless you insist on reading it or large print, but it's available. The reading is beautiful. The language is amazing. It will put you in a frame of mind of appreciation of Agnes herself as a mother. We could talk about how do we deal with grief as women? How does Shakespeare, William, deal with grief? Mm-hmm. As 3 years later, he writes Hamlet. And in Hamlet is there. The death, the grief, the mother, it's all in the play. But how men deal with grief and women deal with grief and a marriage deals with a loss of a child, that Maggie O'Farrell picked up with Agnes Hathaway. So Hamlet is a very worthwhile read during this coronavirus, not to see each other, not to touch each other, not to but language-wise, Sheila,
Good to
thank
see
you. I
you.
think this is
Very good to see all of you.
see all of you together, and be well. That's it. Take care of each other. Thank you, Baba. Thank you, everybody. I don't know who's still on, but I appreciate it. Mwah.
Bye. Thank you
Be
so
well.
much.
And Shana Tova, if I can say
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, Bria.
Shana Tova to everyone.
Kisses, kisses. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.